Hello, this is Angie Yingst, and you're listening to Centered, grounded conversations about the metaphysical. Hello. Today's episode is a little different. I'm answering some personal questions asked by my listeners and followers on Facebook. Most of them are about my life as a healer and teacher. And listen, I love answering questions about my research and my work, where I get to go down rabbit holes. And the personal ones, they can be a little different and difficult because I realize that in all the time that I have spent doing my work, and, I'm coming up on 10 years, this is really not something I do a ton. I hoped, who I am would kind of slide into the background and be anonymous in a way that we can be when we are healers and people who are of service to others. And I honestly thought that was born of humility and shyness, but unsurprisingly, who I am infiltrates everything I do, every client I help, every class I teach. It never really slips into the background. So I often share my wisdom through my own stories and experiences, or the stories and experiences of others that I've helped. And it's often how spirit will speak through me. So when I think of how often I tell a personal story to illustrate some kind of medicine for my students or clients, I blush and I'm completely embarrassed. And I always think like my inner teenager is like eye rolling, like, oh my gosh, you're so embarrassing. Anyway, if all this sounds familiar, it's because I recently wrote a newsletter where I talked about this. When I first got sober, every day I would set an intention, and my intention most days was to talk less and listen more. That didn't work very much because I'm a big talker, but I still wonder how much of it was truly humility, or, as I'm loath to admit, that it was actually a fear of intimacy and a subconscious pushing back from my vulnerability. So if someone said, write about you, I said, oh my gosh, all these people already know me. All I do is write about me. But the truth is that recovery has taught me a lot of valuable lessons, but probably the most important is that your story, my story, is all I have. My mistakes, my failures, my successes, my experience, that is my medicine. It's what I have to pass on. So my trauma is what I have to pass on. And I can do it in shadowy ways that hurt people, or I can do it in ways that help people. So it's why the broken among us are often the best at holding space and being healers, because we've been there. So here I am answering some questions, and, I'd love to have a monthly episode answering questions from you. If you would like to ask me some, you can ask me questions about what I do, about healing, research questions, because I do love doing research, one, and two, I am dedicated to furthering people's spiritual journey. So I'm happy to answer questions about tarot, crystals, shamanic healing, the stuff I do, religions, things like that. But I'm also really mindful that not everybody knows the lingo, words and phrases and concepts that me and other spiritual woo-woo people take for granted. So you can also ask questions like that. If you have any questions, you can send them to Angie at the Moon and Stone, or go to my anchor.fm centered portal, and you can record a question and have your voice on. So thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy this episode of Centered. So my first question is from Liz Grimaldi. She said, what's your backstory? How and where did you grow up? Did you have a different career before finding your current path? How did you get started on this journey? And then whatever you're comfortable discussing about your history. So sure, I can tell you my backstory. I hope it won't be too long, but I grew up in eastern Pennsylvania in a rural area outside of Allentown, Pennsylvania. I had a really ideal middle-class upbringing, like in a little neighborhood in the middle of nowhere. I had lots of kids that I played with. My parents were both working class. They hadn't gone to college. My dad was a Vietnam vet, is a Vietnam vet. And he was a forklift driver in warehouses. He was a really smart guy, very funny, but really had a lot of anxiety and depression, and drank heavily. So he never like missed a day of work or was abusive in any way physically, but he was very distant in his own way. And my mother is from Central America. She emigrated here in 1968 or 69, something like that. And she is also super smart, very beautiful. And she was, when I was growing up, she was a secretary. And she worked at like insurance companies, and then she became a social worker. She actually started as a secretary of the health department in Allentown, and then was going on home visits with nurses, educating about lead poisoning or breast cancer at different times, and translating from Spanish to English, because my mother is very good. She has very good English. Like some people can't quite place her accent. But she's so smart, and she actually moved into the AIDS field and became a social worker doing the actual work. Really early in the AIDS crisis, like in 85 or something like that, testing and doing outreach and doing clinics and things like that. And I'm just so proud of the work that she did, helping, people in our area. And, I was surrounded with like a really open discussion about emotions and sex and things like that, or with my mom. So that's why I kind of have no filter when it comes to those things. Like I never notice when people are embarrassed or whatever about sex, because I just don't have that. I never was raised that way. And my parents were like 18 in 1968, so they were listening to like Led Zeppelin and smoking pot, and they actually named me after the song Angie by the Rolling Stones. I do have an identical twin sister, and we played a lot of sports growing up. We were like latchkey kids, so I grew up with like a lot of anxiety about being alone. Even though I was fine being alone, I was very, very independent. Like I said, I played a lot of sports, so that gave me, I think I was someone who had a lot of confidence growing up because I was confident in my abilities with my body. So, I was a gymnast. I pitched fast pitch softball. I played basketball. I even played football, which was really rare, but not for very long. But I went off to college at Temple University in Philadelphia, where I majored in radio, television, and film. And then I left school around year 2. A lot of the stuff in my family was unraveling. My parents had gotten separated and divorced when I was about 15. So that caused a lot of like trauma in our family, because my father never quite recovered. And started drinking full time. And that was difficult because my sister and I were the only sort of tethers he had, and started getting sick when I was about 18. And when I say sick, I mean he started looking drunk all the time, but he would say, "I'm not drinking." And then one day he had an episode, and it turned out he was ill with multiple sclerosis, and it took like a year or so to get diagnosed with MS. And it was like, he had progressive secondary, so he never had a downtime with his disease. It's not like he had an episode and then went into remission or something like that. He was always getting sicker from the time he had his first episode. So it turned from, not being able to think clearly, not being able to walk, and he was very sick for most of my adult life. And I can only say that like about 25 was when I was going to his home every weekend to clean and take care of him and run errands for him. So it was a lot. Like I became a caregiver very young, and not so young, probably not young couple hundred years ago, but young in our lives. So when I left school about in my sophomore year, I actually drove cross country and moved to Tucson for a few years, where I worked as a barista and an artist assistant and a writer, and I tried on a lot of different hats. I got married to my first husband, who is still like one of my dearest, closest friends, and I adore him. But when we broke up, I moved home to finish school and become a caregiver for my father and my grandfather, who they were living together at the time. I think my great-grandmother was still alive then too. So I changed my major to religion and finished my degree. And when I did that, I began working at a highway engineering firm. And I worked there for 8 years after college in their marketing department. I started as a temp, and then I moved up and was putting together requests for proposals for state road work. And then I began writing copy and for like marketing materials, newsletters, RFPs. At some point I became a creative coordinator, so I was like coordinating all of our creative projects, like newsletters and brochures and things like that. So I loved it. It sounds so different than what I did, and it was. I worked with a lot of men, and it was a lot of engineers, which if you've ever been around engineers, it's just fun. They're like very nerdy and research oriented and very fact based. And I think like it really helped me hone not taking things personally, one. Also learning how to write things that were what seemed like uninteresting and unsexy to me in sexy ways. So like making a bridge sound like a great feat, which it's amazing. And I really, really loved land use planning and really considered doing a master's degree in land use planning because I enjoyed that so much. I actually would have stayed in that career for the rest of my life, but I had my first child. I met my husband when I was working there, and I had my first child, Beatrice. And my husband's a nurse anesthetist, and he was in graduate school when I met him, and he graduated like a month after B was born. So we decided that I would stay home with B, which was a total luxury for us. And it was actually like pretty difficult financially, but we did it. And then that was when, I was kind of like full-time mothering, and I began writing and doing art more frequently when B would be taking naps and stuff. And I really considered homeschooling and doing all that stuff. I loved being home with my baby. And when she was 2, I got pregnant. Well, she was 1. I got pregnant with my second daughter, who was stillborn at 38 weeks. And that's really where my whole world fell apart. I'd always been like a spiritual person. I have my degree in religion, like I said, and I really was focused on Buddhism. So I meditated daily, and my Catholicism that I was raised with was part of my psyche. I would, pray a lot and meditate. But I was so gutted and grief-stricken. I really, I could talk about this part of my journey for a really long time, but I wrote publicly about it on a blog. I've had a couple of my essays published in books about this part of my journey because I really grieved out loud and I grieved publicly, and I had some really beautiful experiences doing that. Connected me with, grieving parents all over the world. My best friend, Jess Southwood, who I did record an episode with earlier in my podcast journey, is like we got connected and we have been close ever since then. But, you know, at that point in my life, writing flowed. Like, I could easily write 12 hours a day. And sometimes I feel like I might have done that. I would stay up after B went to bed and write and write and write and have a little drink. So that was really like the sacred opening, I think, and the beginning of my journey for healing, because my daughter Lucia, when she died in 2008, she really saved my life, you know, because she opened me up in ways that I didn't even know was possible. I went through the valley of hell. And in that wake of that, you know, I had to contend with all these different parts of my shadow controlling different things. And it destroyed a lot of my relationships. Like, most of my friendships at that time fell apart. Some I've been able to rebuild, and others have been like permanently damaged because of how I behaved, I guess, quote unquote, behaved. I don't know. I was grief stricken. And also I ignored parts of our relationships that weren't balanced. So, you know, I found, and I had to face and come face to face with a petty, vindictive, jealous part of me. I had to contend with the angry part of me. I had to contend with the traumatized part of me. I had to contend with all of these things that was like the petulant child that could not understand why my child was taken away. And through that process of acting out a lot, I got sober, because one of the things that activated a lot of that was my filter would leave when I would have a little bourbon. So I did get sober, especially because of my father's history with drinking, and his parents, not his father, but his mother, and my grandparents. All my grandparents, besides my grandmother on my mother's side, are alcoholic pretty much. So I had to contend with that. And when I got sober in 2010, it was a big deal. And so through that process, that's really where my healing work began, because that part of my journey meant that I no longer had this shield that was alcohol, or what my friend or what Athena, you know, I call it. I had taken some classes with Athena, and I remember her calling it a soul sedative. What is your soul sedative? And I thought, oh my gosh, that's exactly what it was. It was like numbing all of my psychic, empathic, raw nerves that were out there. And when I found alcohol, life wasn't so loud, you know, it was just dulled, and I needed that. So when healing began to call me, I did the healing on myself first, and then I realized, like, oh, okay, I'm also being called to help others. So that's part of my story. I had 2 other children. I have Thomas and Zachary, and you know, luckily they've never seen me drink, which is pretty freaking amazing. And yeah, I'm just very grateful for my story. Okay, Mark Manor asked, I want to know what opened the vault in your soul that sparked the walking encyclopedia we ask questions to on Wednesdays. So if you don't know, I work for Hibiscus Moon Crystal Academy and answer questions for our students on Wednesday. And I do a little research, but mostly answer questions on the spot. So you know, I'm not going to lie. I've like really always been a nerd and a research monkey, and I love going down rabbit holes. And I'm someone who literally has to, and this is probably ADHD, but I have to set a timer so that I remember to go to the bathroom, because I forget and I get so like entrenched in my research that I will like ignore my bodily functions. So, but I think, you know, my main spiritual opening was probably getting sober and having to deal with my psychic self, which is the sensitivity, the way I lacked boundaries, my empathic, compassionate part, I really did feel like a raw nerve, and the world was just like much too loud and sharp and bright and all of those things. So it was then that I really started having psychic experiences again, like I did as a child. So when I was a kid, I would, sometimes see angels and ascended masters and who I know now. I didn't realize at the time, of course. Then I would see ghosts and things like that. And, when I found drinking, which wasn't until I was a little older, like I wasn't one of those kids that did anything bad in high school. But I realized like I drank partially to numb the empathic side of me and the psychic side of me, and to deal with other people and myself and going out in public and all that stuff. So really getting sober was the main thing for me. I got back in touch with the artist who was in me, the writer, the healer, the psychic, and really embraced my nerdish ways. And I have always loved words and research and knowledge. So I think like that's kind of my path, is to really go deep with some things. I'd probably, if I, had taken different paths, would probably have just been like a PhD student at some point. I mean, I wish I had been encouraged to do science, because I love science. And I just read so much and listen to so much about science. So anyway, that's it. So Susan Hazard asked, other than crystal, shamanic, Reiki reference books, what books and topics do you read to feed your spirit? Do you subscribe to channels like Gaia or listen to particular podcasts? I am a serious podcast junkie. Like, in fact, in that little thing my first grader filled out for Mother's Day, where it says like, my mom is blank. My mom's favorite color is blank. It said my mom's favorite thing to do is listen to podcasts, which is true. It's very true. I listen to podcasts when I'm not writing or doing work where I'm doing research. And my favorite podcast right now is Ologies by Allie Ward, which is a science podcast. She explores different areas of study, so she calls them ologies. And I just love it. And she goes really deep with that, and I have enjoyed that. I'm really into plants and plant medicine right now, so I'm kind of interested in those kind of ologies too. But she really speaks to experts in their field, which I learned so much. So I also love the podcast Plants of the Gods, which is by Dr. Mark Plodkin, who's an ethnobotanist, and he has worked with shamanic tribes in the Amazon. He is so amazing. And this this podcast is really about the different plants that are used as medicine and shamanic work. So or like mood altering or mind altering, and he calls them plants of the gods, because that's what the tribes in the Amazon call them. So I've also been listening to his book, The Amazon, on audiobook for a few months when I have downtime, and that's fascinating too. I like Revisionist History by Malcolm Gladwell. That's a great one. I also really love Maintenance Phase, which is with Aubrey Gordon and Mike, I forget his last name, but they really talk about like diet culture and do research on trends in dieting and stuff like that, and like debunk a lot of even the stuff that's in our community with alternative healing and stuff like that. I like Adam Grant's Work Life podcast. I listen to that every time it comes out, like it's the first thing I listen to. And it's funny because I'm not in a corporate environment anymore, but I am very interested in the psychology of organizations and what motivates people in terms of work. I like The Confessional by Nadia Bolz-Weber. She is, if you don't know her, a Lutheran minister, and she has people tell their story, and she calls it The Confessional because it's kind of usually their worst story about how they made a mistake or how they hurt someone else and how they live with that. I also listen to a lot of comedy, and I love comedy, and I love comedy podcasts. So I listen to Dana Carvey's podcast. I listen to his podcast with David Spade called Fly on the Wall. I listen to Sarah Silverman's podcast every week, but my absolute favorite is Conan O'Brien's podcast, Conan Needs a Friend, because I love him. And then I also listen to news podcasts like The Daily. I listen to Code Switch. I listen to Fresh Air. I listen to Radio Lab. I listen to The Moth. So I kind of go through different phases. And so like right now I have a bunch of moths that I haven't listened to because I haven't been into storytelling. I've been more into science ones. So I listen to a lot of music. I listen to a lot of jazz. So Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Dizzy Gillespie, Stan Getz, Dave Brubeck, Thelonious Monk. I love singers like Chet Baker and Ella Fitzgerald. I also listen to a lot of like punk rock. I love the Velvet Underground. I love the Pixies. I love Bjork. So I kind of like rotate through. Right now I'm like really into this morning mix I made, which has like all 60s women singers and men singers. So a lot of, soul and stuff like that. So it's fun. I do read a lot. I read before bed. And that I try really hard not to read anything research based. So I read a ton of like novels. I love literary fiction. And I read a lot of like historical fantasy or witchy fantasy, witchy romance books. I'm currently reading Paula Braxton's latest book, The Witch's Night, which I love her. She writes a lot of cool witchy books set in Wales. So yeah, that's my thing that gets me going. Many things that get me going. Okay, Audrey asked me on Instagram, what's your favorite animal to work with in Journey? And I honestly don't know if I have a favorite animal, but I tend to work with certain animals for certain work. So they're my favorite to do that work with. Like my teacher, Pixie Lighthorse, taught me how to work with mountain lion for boundaries, for example. She introduced mountain lion to me for that work. And whenever I do boundaries work, even with clients, I call in the mountain lion. And I love mountain lion because mountain lion's very fierce, but also very protective. And sometimes I feel like I need that patrolling my boundaries. I love feeling protected as I grew up with some anxiety and worry. And when I'm alone, thinking that mountain lion is patrolling and keeping my boundaries safe really is comforting for me. I also work with bear for very similar reasons. So like these apex predators are really great for me and working with them in Journey with my own fear-based approaches to life. So, which I don't really let out very much, and it isn't like very present for me anymore, but that's because I've worked with these animals for so long that they kind of feel that way. And I feel like bear's always been with me. I can remember having bear dreams when I was like 5 or 6 of a bear coming and like coming into my home and holding me, So I think, bear always puts me in like a really heart-centered place and opens my heart to healing and has a very maternal feeling for me. So I work with bear for some of that like mothering that I need. So I have worked with bear for a long time. Bear's been an archetype and a guide for me. So that's probably like, if I had to guess, like, or I said, not guess, but say what my favorite animal was, bear is one of those that I go to. I don't work with a lot of prey animals, though. I think rabbit is probably the closest one for me because of my creative work, and rabbit is a wonderful ally for creative work because even though they're scared all the time, they still keep creating. And so like the anxiety of putting yourself out there, that's a rabbit thing. So I think rabbit would probably be one of the closer ones for me. I work with buffalo, but I've moved away from that a little bit as time has gone on. Sue Peterson, who is my dear friend, asks, what things, activities, and relationships did you lose or have to let go of on your spiritual journey, and how do you navigate the changes? That's such a good question. I really kind of struggled with this question a little bit because I think like I lost stuff before I really got on my spiritual path, which is how I got on my spiritual path, was kind of hitting a bottom. But so drinking and partying was the first to go. And I struggle with certain kinds of media, particularly like violent things. I used to love movies just for movies' sake. And I would watch anything, and I never reacted. I kind of prided myself on not being like a big crier in movies. And now I cry whenever somebody's getting hurt, or like literally I will cry at Hallmark movies because I'm just like a weepy mess. So I really shield myself from violent things. And, my husband and I watched Game of Thrones when that was on. And I swear I watched maybe a third of the shows because my hands were covering my eyes. And I would just like even cover my ears because I couldn't even hear that stuff. And I would just have him describe to me what happened or tell me what happened afterward, like, oh, did he kill that guy, and stuff like that. So anyway, so I struggle handling anything scary or violent, though one of my favorite shows is Law and Order SVU, so I don't know what that means, but I can watch some things that talk about that, but I can't even watch like a superhero movie. It's pretty pathetic. But in general, I think not caring for myself is not acceptable anymore. And I've had to really let go of things like staying up late. I've not really had to give up too many relationships, but I think I am like really protective of who I let into my family now and into my life. I'm not too social in general. I have a couple of really close friends, but I tend not to. And I'm very, very friendly with a lot of people. Like, I think people think I'm super extroverted and outgoing because I'm not afraid to talk to people and just introduce myself and ask them about them and stuff like that. But I tend to not be really good in crowds or in groups. So like parties aren't my forte. I'm better one-on-one with people. So I tend to not be in places where there's alcohol or drugs. Though I can be, I just don't really need to go to places like that. My kids haven't really they haven't seen me drink, but they also have never seen anyone drink, which is interesting and shocking. But that's just the way it is. So I think the hardest part of my spiritual path, the hardest lessons I've had to learn are how to maintain boundaries within my practice and with like students and clients, because honestly, the people that come to see me are so cool and awesome, and I really like them, and I want, being friends with them seems like a natural transition. But in the same token, I've had to maintain boundaries in that way. Like, they can be friends or they can be clients, but they can't be both at the same time right away. Now, I do have some people that I see that are my friends, but in general, I have not been great at navigating those boundaries the best. So I have had to learn that the hard way. And that's been really, really difficult. I think I've probably failed some people in that realm, being a teacher who, thought I could bridge like the friendship thing and just couldn't. I wasn't very good at that and probably acted in ways that were unprofessional or, wasn't great at walking that line. So I've learned that. So like early in my practice, I was not good at that. So I would have a client who would be like, we should have coffee and hang out sometime. I'd be like, yes. And then we would do it and hang out all the time. And then things would get difficult because they would ask me to do readings for them, or, just the whole thing would get really blurry. And I would like not be sure how to navigate them. But, I feel like my friendships now are really good, equal exchanges of energy. But I regret not following my gut with certain relationships or not setting healthy boundaries, because in the end, I feel like, it wasn't their responsibility to hold that boundary. It was mine. And I didn't do a great job of that. So, I think that's been the hardest lesson. I've written about losing friendships a lot because they have been some of the most painful parts of my life. So yeah, that's kind of, I think, where I would stop there.
Thanks for listening to Centered with me, Angie Yingst. If you'd like to send me a question or comment about this show or any shows, you can send them to Angie@themoonandstone.com.